Hello, hello, everybody. Hello to everybody watching. My name is William Gregory, and we're pre-recording this, so this beard may not be here in real life by the time this goes out. But some of you watching may recognise me as the person who is leading the theatre strand of this summer's BCLT translation summer school. And I suppose one of the reasons that I am the person doing that is because I've been translating plays from Spanish for, about 17 years now, unbelievably. And as I was thinking about this panel approaching today, I was thinking about what I wouldn't have given when I was starting out as a translator of plays to have a better understanding of the thinking that goes on in the organisations and in the worlds and minds of the individuals who have influence, both creative-wise and programming-wise, over what happens to theatre in translation on our stages. And in London, at least, there are 3 companies, by no means the only ones, but 3 very significant ones, who have, over a significant number of years, repeatedly and consistently produced plays in translation, ranging from classics such as our old friends Ibsen and Chekhov, all the way up to brand new contemporary playwriting that is fresh out of the oven. And those 3 theatres are the Royal Court Theatre, the Gate Theatre, and Foreign Affairs. And as luck would have it, joining me today are 3 individuals who have worked closely with those organisations in various capacities and have also worked themselves on multiple projects, including theatre and translation. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome the 3 of you here today. So maybe if you could wave as I introduce you, because if I say on my left, I don't know if that's on the left of the viewer. So on my left, anyway, is Sam Pritchard, who is International Associate at the Royal Court Theatre. South of me is Anthony Simpson-Pike, Director, Dramaturg and Associate at the Gate. And to my right, Trine Garrett, who is Co-Artistic Director of Foreign Affairs, along with partner in crime, Camilla Francis. So thank you very much, the 3 of you, for being here today. I'm really, really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you. So by way of a brief introduction, I'd like just to start to ask each of you, and I'll maybe come to you first, Trine, and then yourself, Anthony, and then you, Sam, just to talk to us a little bit about how plays in translation fit within your own work and the work of the companies that you represent, if that's the right word, and following on to that, to talk about one particular play in translation that you've worked with or experienced that you thought worked particularly well, and let us know why. So, Trine, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for inviting me to start with. I guess, as Foreign Affairs, or not, I guess, but theatre and translation is pretty much everything that we do. So it's funny that you start with me. It is our program. It's all of our productions are theatre in translation. We run a training program for translators. We are celebrating our 10th anniversary this summer, next month, as a matter of fact. And we did our very first translation in 2011, a play called The Contract Killer by a Danish playwright, poet, and singer-songwriter. And that was really our first step into translation. A play found us on the streets of Copenhagen, and that's how our journey began. So yeah, theatre and translation is pretty much what we do all the time.
And how about yourself, Anthony?
Yeah, so I think my face might have frozen.
Oh, it has, I'm afraid. We can still hear you.
Okay, well that's right. I guess it's what I'm saying that's more important than what I look like. Yeah, so I am an associate artist at the Gate Theatre, and the Gate was set up to produce international work at a time when there wasn't a lot going on in London. And it's having its 40th anniversary. And so over the years, depending on artistic directors, the sort of definition of international has shifted and evolved. And that has obviously had an impact on how much work is done in translation, as opposed to how much work within the sort of Anglophone international sphere gets put on. I came in as associate director at the time with Ellen McDougall in 2017. And since then, I'd say roughly half of the work at the Gate has been in translation. So yeah, it's very much part of the DNA of the building and of the programme.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic, thank you. And Sam, how about yourself?
Yeah, I'm an associate director at the court, and my area, one of my areas of responsibility is for our international program. And I guess the focus of work in translation at the court, or the thing that has distinguished it, certainly over the last 20 or so years, has been a focus on translation as part of the development process of new plays. So one of the things that the Royal Court has tried to do in terms of its relationships with playwrights internationally, including playwrights who write in languages other than English, is to work with them as they develop a new play, as well as spotting and producing existing work. And those relationships develop in a number of ways, through writers groups, through residencies, through individual projects with playwrights. But where that writer isn't writing or developing their play in the English language, very often there is a translator who's working closely with them as a collaborator, as part of that process, across sometimes a number of drafts of that play. So I guess that distinguishes the way we work with work in translation.
Yeah. And to the second part of that opening question, I'll do it in reverse and come to you, Sam. Is there, just briefly, is there a play that you've come across that, for any particular reason, you felt has had a particularly successful in whatever way you might want to describe that?
I suppose the example that I was thinking of when you posed the question is really a partnership across multiple plays, but most recently play that we produced 3 years ago, I think now, at the Royal Court, called Bad Roads, by the Ukrainian playwright Natasha Vorozhbit, translated by the Russian language translator Sasha Dugdale, who has worked across maybe 8 or 9 pieces of theatre with Natasha. And I think the thing that really distinguished that for me, as well as it being a fantastic play, is that what exists between Sasha and Natasha is a really extraordinary and long-term collaboration between a translator and a playwright that is as much about a shared conversation about the context that the work has arisen from, and the context in which that work might be produced, and how to curate and shape that context, about the writer's rehearsal room experience, about well, really, I think they wouldn't mind me saying a long-term friendship as well, and in all sorts of subtle ways, I think, as well as all sorts of artistic ways, in terms of the extraordinary quality of Sasha's translation. It's the depth of that relationship that contributes a huge amount to the success of that artist's work being produced.
Thank you.
In English in the UK.
Thank you. Yeah, I saw that production, and I think that was plain to see in the production. Actually, it was an extraordinarily powerful piece of work. And Anthony, that same question to you. Could you talk to us a little bit about one particular play in translation that, for any particular reason, sort of stays in your memory as a particularly successful or enjoyable experience to work on?
Yeah, I was thinking about your question, and I think I'm gonna talk about an experience at the Royal Court, actually, which was a show which wasn't a play in translation, but it was Ifrai, and part of that was translated into BSL as part of the rehearsal process, and I think that was incredibly successful, and in terms of it clarified the scene. It was a real experience of collaboration between all of the actors and the interpreter as well. It improved accessibility, and it felt like a sort of like active exchange and embodied translation. So I think that's probably the best example I can think of.
And that BSL was part of the performance.
Yeah,
that's great. Thank you. Well, I think that's a hugely important addition to the conversation, because of course translation into BSL is translation, is indeed, and I think it's really important for us to be mindful of including that translation when we talk about theatre translation.
Yeah.
Trine, over to you. The same question.
Thank you. It was hard to choose, to be honest. So I chose the one that has both huge relevance for me as a person, as an artist, as well as the company. And it has to be our recent production of The Warm House by Danish playwright Anna Bro, translated by Paul Russell Garrett. So I'm not particularly objective about it, obviously, because of the overemphasis on the Garretts. And being Danish myself, when I first read the play, I was immediately struck with how Danish it was, and I questioned whether that would translate at all. I wasn't sure about it. So when we read it for the first time with a group of actors, I was blown away with how everyone in the room, coming from various places across the UK, mainly in that reading, how they connected with the piece straight away. They knew these people, although they were so Danish. So that one went into production, and we did one of our usual site found productions, and again the audiences seemed to have the same connection with these people, although I had made the choice of making it as Danish as it possibly could get in its production values, in its culture and everything. And we had several audiences going, I know these people, they're my family, they're my friends, it's down at the pub. And I thought that's exactly the kind of plays that kind of stand out for me sometimes, that although they are foreign or from afar, there is something that we connect with, be it exact same experiences or that recognizable, but that shared humanity. And then on a personal level, as a migrant artist, it was lovely to be able to share a bit of my culture in my adopted home. So yeah.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to move on now to hone in a little bit more about maybe some of the maybe the general principles about the particular companies that you work with in terms of how that works, how that relates to translation. I'll come to you first, Anthony, if I may, and to talk about one of the aspects of the work at the Gate, which is the manifesto that the Gate brought out, I think, to tune in with the 40th anniversary, if I'm not mistaken. And I would say if anyone has any interest at all in working with the Gate, that is prime reading, absolutely vital reading. I picked out a couple of lines from it which I think are of interest to translation. You may have other ones, but there's lines in it such as text is not the only form of authorship, and any text from earlier than 2010 must be radically interrogated. I'm interested to ask you how you see translation and the translator being part of addressing those sorts of questions, and indeed the manifesto more widely.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the sort of provocation of text is not the only form of authorship. It's really about collaboration and recognizing the work of everyone in and outside of the room in authoring the production. And of course, you know, translators are also authoring the work in more obvious ways. But it's I guess what feels exciting about those manifesto points is that they're all sort of provocations to imagine new ways of working, or and I definitely think that the translator has a role in that. One thing I've been thinking about recently is and it's important to say as well that, like, in the sort of new plays in translation that were done at the Gate, Chris Campbell, for example, translated Susie Stork and was in rehearsals for that. So that relationship changes depending on where the text is at the time. But yeah, I think it would be really interesting to look at sort of using multiple languages and involving translators in the rehearsal process in that exchange as well. But you know, it's really a provocation, and hopefully it will lead to lots of exciting ways of collaborating.
Fantastic, thank you. I think some of that might resonate with you, Trine, but I'm going to come to you in a moment. I'm just going to turn to Sam first and ask about the way that translation works in the Royal Court process, which, as you've already mentioned, you're often working with plays in multiple drafts, brand new plays that are being written by often emerging writers. Is there a particular function for the translator, or a particular way of thinking about the translation that is important when you're doing that kind of work?
I think yes, there is when translation is operating in a more dramaturgical context. Of course, translation is always engaged dramaturgically, but when a translator is working with a writer, and particularly with a writer who they're translating for the first time across multiple drafts of the play, it feels that communication around the text is really crucial and important, and the opportunity for translators to be in touch with writers closely and carefully, for there to be a good dialogue between the dramaturgs or individuals who are supporting and talking to the writer about their work, and the translator, so that there's a real understanding of how language is being used, and what choices may be about translation, and what choices are about style and form, and sit differently in the original theatre culture, in the original cultural context, in the original linguistic context. And I think in that context, sort of increasingly, I feel that it's important that the translator is plugged into those other relationships and conversations, but also that they don't feel that the weight is, because there is a responsibility, I think, that a lot of translators who work with us on plays that are developing rather than texts that have been performed and produced already and are now being translated into a new language. And I think there's a really complicated thing that we often talk about not making the translator the sole person who's responsible for that active communication. Of course, they are responsible for translating the draft, but there's a whole set of other conversations that need to happen around that with other writers and artists who are working with the writer, and who have knowledge and understanding of the existing theatre culture that they're writing from, and of the text as it is in the language in which it's written. So there's, I think, in our work often a really complicated web of relationships there, and lots of opportunities for missteps, and for us to be constantly recalculating those things.
So it sounds like the more conversation that happens around those things, the better, by the sounds of it.
I think so. And particularly, I think maybe this is, I'm sure this is true at the Royal Court, maybe this is true of theatre in this country more generally, but I think it's really important that the days of the translator as a remote figure who delivers a draft and maybe consults with the writer, but isn't a theatre maker who's involved in exactly the way Anthony's talking about in a rehearsal room context. Those days are hopefully gone.
Great, thank you. So now to you, Trine, and I think maybe there's probably a lot of resonance there for you as well. But one thing that I think is particularly beautiful about the work of Foreign Affairs is that you're a proudly international company with what maybe a semi-permanent company, could we say, of actors and other practitioners who you regularly work with, many of whom come from a wide variety of national and linguistic backgrounds. And I'm interested to hear from you about how, when you're working on a play that's being translated, usually into English, how working with a company like that and those individuals plays into the way that the translation emerges.
Brilliant. It's such a good question, because it's a question we've been asking ourselves for the last 6 months, in the sense that in our early part of our translation journey, or working with translation, we were very adamant about having native English speakers being part of the translation process, because that is what it should be. And as we've evolved, we are challenging ourselves on that notion. We've always done that, but you kind of fall into, when you're working on the I won't even say the fringes, I'll say in the basement. So we carved out a bit of a basement niche, and you feel sometimes you have to do things the proper way, or you try, or should we be doing this? So what we've been doing over the last 6 months in particular is rejecting our own practice in that sense, and taking ownership of our own English, and celebrating that within our processes, which brings me often back to Geraldine Brody's book about it. Often when you're working with translation, it's so much about what's the company that's going to produce it, or and perform it. So I think sometimes it depends on the purpose. So we've evolved in our thinking very much, so it does influence how we work in the translations, and it very much depends on where it's going. Is it staying with us, or is it going elsewhere? And celebrating the complexity of the English language in its current form and as it evolves, and that our English is part of it, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thank you for making. I think that's such a crucial point, and something that across all of translation we really need to take responsibility for thinking about more, which is this question of, to put it bluntly, Bruce, in a simplified way, whose English is it anyway? You know, who has the right to decide what correct English is? You know, and especially when we're living in these times and in a city like this, or when we're living in the world, frankly, those are questions I think it's really important that we interrogate. And actually, Anthony, thinking again about the manifesto of the Gate, if I remember rightly, there is a reference to being multilingual in the Gate's practice as well. So I wondered if what Trine has just said resonates with the way that the Gate thinks as well, or works.
I think that definitely, like, there is more that can be done in that regard, and it's, you know, it is it's interesting that in London that there aren't many opportunities to see work that is multilingual or isn't in translation. And I guess with the Shabak Festival that we did last year, we were kind of looking at that question as well. But yeah, I think it's definitely a work in progress and something that needs to continue to evolve. And yeah.
Thinking specifically about multilingual productions, I mean, one very recent one at the Royal Court was Faces in the Crowd by Valeria Luiselli.
At the Gate, do you mean?
At the Gate, apologies, sorry, it's the Gate. Which was an adaptation of an English translation of a novel by Christine. So the translator was Christine McSweeney, which then Ellen McDougall adapted. And that was a multilingual production with not a lot of use of Spanish. And that was the second example I've seen at the Gate of a play that is an adaptation of a translated novel. And I know we'll have quite a few viewers who are not necessarily theatre translators, but who translate novels. So I'd be just interested to hear you talk a little bit about that element of the Gate's work, and again, what role translation might have in that.
Yeah, well, one of the things that we found is because what we've been trying to do is think about what it means to be international and expand that past a definition that's like America and, you know, USA and English speaking countries. We've also been thinking about how to interact with writing cultures that aren't necessarily that don't necessarily run in the same way as here, so that you can't necessarily just write to someone's agent and ask for them to send a few plays over, or if you could, then, you know, you'd need to get them translated, and so we've just been trying to broaden the sources of the stories that we can find, and part of that is looking at short stories and novels, and other work that isn't necessarily like a ready-made play. And so, yeah, so adaptation is definitely a huge part of the conversations we've been having.
Coming back to you, Sam, and again, thinking about the particular way that the Royal Court works, which is that when a play does find its way to full production at the Royal Court, a play in translation, it is often the world premiere in any language, which I think is really unusual. I was thinking, and I failed to check this, but I have something in the back of my mind that the first ever production of A Doll's House may have been a translation, but don't quote me on that. I need to double check. but this is fairly unusual, and I wondered if that brought out any particular pressures or questions that you have about this question of presenting international work when the world premiere is in English. Very unusual.
I guess it is relatively unusual, although I think it might only be unusual. I feel like that itself might be a sort of a more Anglo-centric unusualness, in that I know that increasingly German theatres in their work with international artists, both English language and outside the English language, are producing work that is translated into German for its first outing. And so maybe maybe that is become in a world where the approach to language in theatre is hopefully more flexible in the way that we've all suggested. That's becoming less and less the case. And I suppose there is I don't know whether responsibility is the right word, but there is a dynamic that exists in the process of producing a piece of work that hasn't been produced in its original language, but is being produced for the first time in translation in another language, that is about a clarity around context and not pulling the play too closely towards the context of in this case English as a language, in order to meet or satisfy the expectations of an audience. But then I think that's probably a dynamic that exists whether or not you're dealing with a world premiere or whether it's just the first English language production of a writer's play.
Thank you. So I'm going to shift the conversation slightly now, because we're going to have we have an audience of literary translators, all of whom, after hearing you talk, I'm sure now desperately want to work with all of you. And there's a question of the how. You know, how does it come about that a play finds its way to being produced, and how does it come about that any particular translator finds himself being the translator of that play, which is a bigger question, I think, than it may seem to be at first glance. I think it also chimes into a converse question, if you like, about pipeline and the challenges that people like yourselves face in wanting to access the work, but having challenges in how it is that you can the opportunities you have to find it. So I'd really love to hear your reflections. I'll maybe start with you, Sam, if I may, on that question. How does the work get picked, and how do you even find it?
I suppose to answer the first part of your question about the selection of work, part of the answer for us is often the very early stage development work that we're doing with writers internationally. So through open application group projects that we run outside the UK, but also residency projects that we run in the UK, which are usually open application, although sometimes are for individual artists. And that process in some ways mirrors, or in many ways mirrors, the process of writer development as it exists, or the development of work by early career writers as it exists in the other parts of the Royal Court's practice with writers in the UK. And so often there's a long process through which a writer gets to know the Royal Court, and there's a longer conversation that sits behind the moment where a piece of work gets selected or programmed, and part of that process is the pairing of that writer with a translator, and a conversation about how that pairing is working, and whether the translation is reflecting exactly what it needs to about the play in its original language. And I guess to answer, I feel like the second half of your question is a really key one, and you and I have talked about this in other contexts. I think part of the journey towards translators being engaged with as major collaborators in theatre and translation is also about a thorough and complex examination of what the pathways are into working as a translator, how we are as institutions ensuring the widest possible range of opportunities for practitioners who might want to work as translators to get to know that as an art form, so that there is a much greater diversity in terms of the voices who are representing and supporting the representation of international work in the UK. And I think that is a conversation that's, in my limited experience or my narrow experience, under-examined and really needs to happen.
Absolutely, yeah. I'd absolutely agree with that. And Anthony, you touched earlier on the challenges that the Gate faces in terms of how to find the work in the first place. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I guess I think one barrier for us, one real barrier is funding. You know, there's a really small team at the Gate, so it's really difficult to engage sort of like speculative translations. You know, even if we have even if we have access to a bank of work that could be really exciting to look at, such as Out of the Wings or Viability, it really depends on like who within our sort of team has access to those languages, because we won't ever ask anyone to work for free. Although translators at university have offered to do that, I don't think that that's right, and that's a principle that you know, we won't kind of cross. But it is hard, because you know, I think projects like Out of the Wings really exciting, but I just don't know where to start with it, because it's, you know, I don't speak Spanish. There are so many plays in there. I don't really know where to start with it. But so I think if there were clearer ways of, as Sam says, you know, I think that there should be some artist development for theatre translators at buildings, so that kind of brings in more people and makes it a really key sort of collaborative member of the team in people's minds as well as in practice. But I think funding also is needed to try and open up that other side of it as well.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, I'd agree with that. Absolutely, it's this vicious circle, isn't it? That you can't make decisions about plays without seeing the translations, but the translations can't come into play if they're. And translators, as much as we'd love to, we can't be speculatively translating plays. So thank you. Thanks for articulating that. And I really hope that there are steps that can be taken. And actually that segues quite neatly to you, Trine, because I happen to know that one of the ways in which you find translations and translators is by running a theatre translation programme at Foreign Affairs. So I've already snuck in part of the answer for you, but please, please don't be over-guided by that. How you find the work that you engage with.
Well, so I'm trying to remember the question, but I guess it's how we find translations.
Yeah, so how do you find translators and translators?
Yeah. Well, I think I will, yes, obviously talk about our translation mentorship program and its surrounding activities, where we, picking up on what you said, Anthony, in particular offer professional development for translators who may not have experience in translating for the stage, or theatre practitioners with language skills, to pick up on what you said, Sam, who may want to translate for the stage. So that's what kind of our flagship professional development program, and a lot of translations come our way. Through that we discover loads of new plays as well as translators. So I would also say that a lot of translations come, or plays rather, plays from around the globe come to us directly from the translator, and then as a consequence of that relationship, a second one then comes from the playwright who then wants the next play translated, or maybe just another play translated rather than the first one. So we've built, in spite of our micro size, a lot of fruitful relationships with translators. They have become our I was going to say spies, but that's not the right word, but I can't find another word right now. I wanted to say really positive. They are champions, they are advocates, they're diplomats. But also the playwrights then know us and they'll get in touch with us. So it's a very fruitful relationship. So yeah, so through our mentorship program, and I've checked with the boss, Camilla, that you mentioned earlier, we have just initiated the part 2 of the mentorship this summer. So there is now a sequel to the mentorship, which is very much looking at how can the theatre translator continue to hone their skills in a collaborative environment. Just as I'm a trained actor by profession, so I take continuous acting classes, voice, and so forth. How can the theatre translator do the same, continue to work on their craft? So we have actually a little initiative coming out very, very soon, building on our mentorship. So those are the multiple ways we find new plays as a micro company, because absolutely we face the financial barrier, very much so. We can't produce all the plays, so some of them have made their way elsewhere. As it happens, we actually read Faces in the Crowd with Christina a few years ago, and we loved it, but I'm so happy it found a home at the Gate, because I think the Gate is the right company to produce it. So I think sometimes that, not that we didn't want to produce it, but we just felt it wasn't the time. So yeah, so and others have traveled across the pond to the US. So yeah.
Thank you, Trine. So we're coming close to running out of time, and I just want to broaden this moment out a little bit, because we talked a lot about sort of translation as well, but of course we're sitting here at a moment where theatre in the UK is going through a huge set of challenges, and I won't list them all, because I'd actually like to invite you to tell us the ones that you think are most important. But I think we can agree there's a lot of challenge at the moment and ahead. And I'd like to ask you, as a closing remark, to reflect on that and to think what, if anything, can translation do to be part of addressing that? Maybe Sam, if I could come to you first.
I have to take the hit and answer the huge.
Well, I mean, I appreciate it's an enormous question, and I sort of, you know, speaking as a translator, I think we can sometimes, we care a lot about what we do, and we care about doing it well. There's also a risk maybe that we sort of elevate how important we can be, but I think there's something important to consider about the work that we can do can be an agent of change, and it's an important opportunity for us to reflect on that, I think.
I think this is, I think in terms of the space we're in, or we're hopefully coming out of now, there's a challenge in terms of those of us who work in theatre, at least, on collaborations with international artists and institutions, about being as bold and front-footed as possible in a return to those kinds of collaborative relationships, and not allowing, and I think this is really hard when everyone's had a very different experience of the lockdown and the new set of circumstances that's put us all in terms of the ability to travel and the ability to engage internationally. But I think there's also I feel there's also a danger in us, particularly bigger institutions, allowing a sense that is difficult and challenging work, and that will be the last kind of work to return. And oh my God, of course, it's going to be incredibly hard for you to run this project with international artists, or how are you going to do that? I think unless we are activist in putting that firmly back on the agenda with all sorts of other work, as Anthony's already mentioned, there is international work in the UK has suffered, or work that engages with international artists or is in translation in the UK has suffered from limited exposure historically, or not getting as big a bite of funding opportunities, maybe, as other kinds of work, and it feels important to make the case for that in whatever new world we're moving into. And I suppose this isn't about translation, but one of the sort of optimistic things we've experienced here at the Royal Court is that the writers groups that we work on in the UK, which have always happened in a physical space upstairs at the theatre, have never been able to embrace international writers and artists, because of because we've always felt that the internet provides a kind of unequal experience of the room and of the shared environment. But of course, now all of those groups are in an online space, and so we've been able to bring international writers, writers who are working in translation, into the same space as the writers and the artists we're working with here for the first time, which has been really inspiring for us. And I think then, of course, the next stage is, well, can we do that? But can we do that across a language barrier? What does a writers group that contains writers working in 3 different languages online look like, with interpreting, with the involvement of translators to support communication, the ability of writers to read each other's work. So there are some reasons for hope on that front, maybe.
Thank you. Trine, I'll come to you now, if I may. That same question, where we're the present moment that we're in and looking to the future, what's on your mind?
Oh, wow, in relation to translation. Well, it's part of our, as a theatre company, it's part of our DNA as an artist, as a migrant. I translate in many ways every day. It is part of who we are. I think what translation offers is a window into worlds beyond our own. And I think in order to solve, or rather than solve, deal with Oh, I was about to swear. I have a sign on my laptop, please do not swear, because I always end up swearing in these kind of things. In these complex situations we're in right now with the COVID-19, with the climate crisis, with the Brexit situation and so forth, I think it's so important that we look beyond our own worlds. We collaborate on a global level, and as a theatre company where collaboration and international collaboration is at the heart of everything, it's like a micro expression, and translation there is essential. And I think part of that conversation is also giving space for a lot of the, I guess is what you're talking about, Anthony, about interrogating or questioning, challenging, what does it mean to be international? There is a wealth of creativity, skills and experiences with all the wonderful migrants that are in the UK within the theatre industry and beyond the creative industries, and also, yeah, collaborate. Yeah.
Thank you. And Anthony, that same question to you. The challenges that we're facing at this moment and looking to the future, what's on your mind in regard to that, and how might translation be part of that?
Yeah, well, we're facing some quite obvious challenges in terms of the pandemic that we're in right now and what that does in terms of, as Sam mentioned, making people feel risk averse and sort of like exploding that question of like what is seen as risky and what isn't. And we're looking at Brexit, we're looking at the climate crisis, we're looking at the rise of nationalism across the world, and for me, translation is inherently an act of exchange. So there's something therefore collaborative about it that can't that can't be changed. So I think there's something about us looking outwards, and at the same time caring for and looking after the migrant communities that live here. But translation is absolutely part of that insofar as exchange and collaboration and getting to know one another is part of what that's all about. I think that the sort of like internet and digital space has been really exciting in kind of opening up the possibilities, as Sam mentioned. And I think that we should also be thinking about that as well as we go forward and think about how can we collaborate across nations and across countries in a way that is also sustainable as we look to the climate crisis, and trying to reshape the way that we work and how we recover from the present sort of very immediate crisis.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I fear that we've gone over time, but that's because everything you've been saying has been just so fascinating and thought-provoking, and it really has been a privilege to spend some time talking to the three of you and hearing your thoughts. It's just so invaluable to those of us who are translators to understand the manifold questions that sit outside of ourselves and the text that we're working on and our laptops. And there's been so much content there that I think it would be so exciting to explore again in more detail, in more conversations, and in more spaces for practice. And so I just really want to thank the three of you very much indeed for giving us your time this afternoon. It's been really excellent. So
thank you.
on that note, this is where I would ask for a round of applause from the audience, but I guess in a digital space that's not something we can do. But but I applaud you, and I don't know if that's an applause. There's an applause. Oh, we can do a digital applause. I won't try and do that because I don't know which button to press. But thank you so much. It's been absolutely fantastic. So a round of applause, please, for Anthony Simpson-Pike, Sam Pritchard, and Trine Garrett. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's 3 o'clock. I've got a new camera and I've trimmed my beard, and we're live for the Q&A session resulting from the discussion that hopefully you've all seen about about translation in the theatre. Here we are. I've not been able to go to the theatre for a long time, and I know the same is true for many of us, and that's been a great sadness. But I must say for myself, it's been an absolute tonic, this 3.5 days to be working as the leader of the workshop of the theatre translation strand. I'm having a fantastic time and going over time most of the time, but not this time, let's hope. We've been doing lots of beautiful detailed work on theatre translation, but of course, of all the translation disciplines, theatre is perhaps, that's up for discussion, but perhaps the one that is most collaborative with others, and that is the reason why it was so wonderful to have the opportunity to talk to Sam Pritchard from the Royal Court, Anthony Simpson-Pike from the Gate, and Trine Garrett from Foreign Affairs about their relationship to translation in the theatre. And I'm going to go straight in because we've got a short amount of time with my first question, which is one that's been on my mind. And I'm going to throw this at you first, Trine, which is a simple question. How do you find translators? Simple question, surely a simple answer.
I hesitate. The simple answer is I find them wonderful. But for anyone who knows me will also know that I'm not particularly objective, as I surround myself with translators one in particular, but generally my friends are translators as well. So wonderful is the simple answer. A slightly longer answer is as a theatre maker, as someone who runs a theatre company who specializes in theatre and translation, the translator or a translator or all translators are invaluable to my work, and they are my best ally in the, or one of my best allies in the rehearsal room, as they are a source of information and knowledge and sometimes unleashed creativity. So that's the slightly longer answer. And I could go on forever, but we only have half an hour.
In practical terms, how do you find them in that sense?
In practical terms?
Yeah, you know, how do they come to you? How is it? How do you end up working?
How do I find? I see. I need a bit more translation on that one. How do I find them? Oh, they contact me and they get recommended via other translators through our translation program. Mm-hmm. I find them on Twitter, in the streets, at events. That's a lie. I've been slightly thrown by my own lack of understanding.
In the streets.
No, that's just me being thrown. Everywhere. You're everywhere in my world. So yeah, but often
also via your program, of course.
Yeah.
People directly apply to that, don't they?
Yeah. I think you better just leave me alone and go read for a while, and I'll come back to you. I'm going to mute.
Okay, I'll pass on to Anthony with that same question.
Yeah, I mean, the answer wouldn't be that different from Trine, which is just through recommendations, kind of knowledge, like by kind of looking at what, plays that you feel have been translated well, and kind of looking, kind of keeping a mental Rolodex of that, speaking to other people, building up relationships.
Okay, Thanks. Sam, have you got anything to add to that from your end?
I suppose our answer is similar in that when we begin a project working in a language that we haven't worked in before, there's a phase of research and seeking out of contacts through other translators, through language departments, through theatre colleagues who've had experience working with writers who work in that language before. And I would sort of slightly diving into the chat and engaging with Lucy's point. I more and more recently I've and I don't know how practically our institution would approach this, but I've been thinking about pathways into translation and the ways in which we make that process of finding translators and translator collaborators and processes much more open, and ways that we can look for new and different freelancers to engage with. And I think that feels like I know Trine is ahead of us in this, in terms of the mentorship and the pathways that allows, but that feels like a really important question at the moment.
Yeah, thanks Sam. I agree, and I really look forward to seeing how that develops over the next over the coming months. I think it's a really important question, and one that I think isn't unique to theatre either. I think the whole literary translation community has been asking itself those questions about ensuring that we have a better range of options for people to get into the profession in the first place. I've got a question here, which it's a very real question. So I'm going to go about commercial pressure, and that idea for a theatre company, which certainly I've been familiar with, of the need to choose, or the perceived need to choose a play based on its commercial viability. I won't second guess what the answer to those questions might be, but I'd be interested if either of the three of you would be interested in going first on that one. Any reflections on that? Okay, Sam.
I'll dive in. I suppose at the Royal Court, at least, we're incredibly fortunate in terms of the way the institution is set up and the subsidy that we receive, allowing us to take risks in terms of programming that mean commercial considerations aren't always at the forefront of the choices we're making, whether that's about first-time writers or writers who write in other languages or who aren't based in the UK. So I don't, for me at least, commercial considerations are very rarely a factor in the decisions that we make.
I mean, I think to elaborate on that question, I guess what lies behind that partly is a perception that audiences would somehow be put off by a play that was a translation or a play that was by a writer whose name they didn't recognise. But I mean, thinking about the Gate, Anthony, when I've been to see productions there of plays in translation, I've often struggled to get a ticket, and it seems there's certainly been an audience there. What are your reflections on that question of audience appeal / commercial viability?
Boringly, the short answer is that it's the same situation that Sam articulated at the Gate. Like, the Gate is fortunate to have a subsidy, which means that commercial considerations aren't the driving factor behind programming decisions. But yeah, no, I mean, the Gate was set up to make work that wasn't happening elsewhere, and has continued to do that. That's kind of the sort of founding mission of it, and that includes, that's the reason that it was set up to be an international theatre as well. I think in general there is a sort of idea of like what work is like risky, and it's kind of been disproven time and time again when we look at across the theatre industry, like the shows that have been incredibly successful even just in the last couple of years, like Barbershop Chronicles or Fairview, or millions of other examples. But, yeah, it's important that programmers constantly interrogate where this idea of risk comes from, and like what is deemed as risky and what isn't.
I'm going to change tack slightly, just ask the specific questions that's coming for you, Trine, about the Foreign Affairs Theatre Translation Mentorship, which is who it is that, when you have this mentorship, who makes the decision about what plays the mentors work on?
Oh, the translators who apply to the program. That's a huge part of the process, and in many ways the program itself starts at the application process in acknowledging the power and the knowledge that the translator has in that field, that they pitched a play, which is also, it seems to me, the role of the translator in the industry at the moment is partially pitching. So that's integrated into the process. We don't make that decision. We then choose the applicants, and then the plays are part of that consideration, a small part. So yeah, the translators.
So I've got a question here about the idea of a translator in residence. We have directors in residence, writers in residence, designers in residence. Dare we dream of a translator in residence at a theatre? Anthony, what do you think?
God, that's difficult.
Fuel my fantasies. Come on, fuel my dreams.
I don't know. I think it's an interesting question, for sure, and worth interrogating. I think it's, it has lots of sides to it as well. It's also important to kind of think about who's the right translator for a particular work, and that might, take in any number of factors, including their own lived experience. And so I think it would be sort of a decision that would be kind of well considered alongside a number of other sort of like competing questions.
So looking at a question here about I suppose the distinction, I suppose, between adaptation and translation, which is always a tricky subject, and that applies in theatre as well. I suppose at the Royal Court, my instinct is to say that there's generally more focus on the idea of a translation rather than an adaptation. But I just wondered, Sam, have you got any reflections on that idea?
I think you're right that the tradition here has well, not here because I'm not at the Royal Court, but at the Royal Court has focused on the close-knit relationship between a translator and a playwright. But I think I'm not a particular fan of having a sort of set approach that doesn't necessarily work for every project. And I've certainly sort of anecdotally recently had conversations with writers who don't write in English, but who have had an experience of being translated, who've said, oh, it's interesting, in my language I've always wanted to try a more complicated collaboration between maybe an English language playwright and in this case it was a Japanese playwright who was saying to me, I really think there's something new that we could crack by working with a combined team. There are plenty of examples of that kind of collaboration having happened in the past. But I think to be dogmatic about ways of approaching it doesn't feel necessarily that it will work best in terms of every collaborative relationship. I think we would never want to undersell or shortchange the extraordinary skill that a translator brings to bear in a process. And in answer to the previous question, we have, at the Royal Court, we have talked quite a bit recently about the idea of a translator in residence. And if anyone runs a major university language department with a large endowment, then we'd be very open to a conversation about how to set up that kind of position, because I think, as we said in the panel, there's real space for I think in our institutions, for the activist translator who has particular kind of work that they want to champion. There's no reason, I think, for us why translators wouldn't be an extraordinary voice in any of our script meetings, our participation projects, community projects, if they were involved in the building in a more central way for a period of time.
Great, thank you. Gosh, it's all so enticing, isn't it? Well, you heard it there, folks. Get in touch with your I nearly said well-endowed. Oh, I did say well-endowed universities. Trine, so similar, I'm going to sort of squeeze that question into another question for you. So I'd be interested to think about how you view the idea of adaptation versus translation in the work of foreign affairs. But equally, you spoke very eloquently about the Warm House and how how successfully your audience felt it communicated that Danish reality. And so there's a question there about adaptation and also the D word, domestication. So I'm interested in what is your thinking around those concepts when you're working at foreign affairs?
Well, first, I feel like I would need to have a very long conversation about what an adaptation is. I once heard a translator say, so I didn't say this, that every translation is a form of adaptation. But I think that's another conversation. And then I would echo what Sam was saying, that it all depends on the project. It all depends on the company, the setting, the times, and what that demands. And as an international company where at least half of our performers are non-UK born, we speak with accents and have many funny misunderstandings in our communications on an everyday basis, it doesn't quite make sense for us to necessarily I don't like that word. Almira had a much better way of saying domestication and it's lost right now, but to transpose it. So we often keep it in its original context. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think there's too many conversations to be had about adaptation and domestication and the awfulness of that word. Yeah. Sorry.
Yes, no, I agree. I think it's not necessarily a helpful binary, and I think that especially when we're thinking about audience as well, let alone people making the theatre, I think that we need to work harder to understand that our audiences are much more varied and diverse than some more traditional binary concepts of translation might lead us to think they are.
Absolutely.
Which perhaps feeds into a broader topic, and one which I think has been slightly touched on by this idea of pathways to translation. There's a question here. You touched on translation as advocacy work in the recorded talk. Can you talk a bit more about what you're doing to elevate voices and the work of people of colour, queer folk and underrepresented people and languages, both behind the scenes and on the stage? That's a broad question, and I'd welcome responses, not limited to translation necessarily, but more generally in the work of the organisations you're working with. I'll take volunteers to go first on that one.
I could say briefly that from a Royal Court perspective, the process that we've been engaged in for the last 6 months is to look really from first principles at how our international work can engage and amplify a different range of voices. And in our, as we touched on in the talk, I think one of our institution has focused to a certain extent on the development of work alongside playwrights, rather than just the discovery of work. And one of the key things for us, I think, has been a really thorough examination of who and how that work is led by, because, as we all know, that has a direct correlation in terms of the voices that get amplified by it. And we're a playwright-centric theatre. So for us, that goes back to which of our playwriting colleagues, the writers whose work goes onto our stages, which of them is leading work internationally for us, who takes on particular groups, how they facilitate those groups, and how they draw in a wide range of expertise, how they work with playwrights and build relationships with playwrights outside of the UK to support the work of a particular group. So that has been key for us.
Thank you. It's an important topic. So I don't, Anthony or Trina, if either of you got any reflections on that you'd like to share from the point of view of your organisations.
I definitely can. So obviously we are a micro-organisation with limited resources, also in terms of manpower. But what we have been doing for the last few months, with everything going on in the media, or not just in the media, going on in the world, we've really taken a long time to take a hard look at ourselves and how we operate and at our processes. And as we were in the middle of the application process for our mentorship program, that was the first place, the first kind of our first process we were investigating, and recognizing that very few people of colour and Black translators were applying at all. So that's an area that we would very much like to investigate. And then we look at our community work. We are based in East London, and we're work a lot with young people in Haggerston. So we're looking at all of these processes and how we can get better at being more inclusive.
Thank you, Trina. Anthony, would you like to add anything from the Gates perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's like a really big question. There's like, you know, you can have a whole kind of talk just dedicated to this, but you know, I guess in terms of what doing to elevate voices and work of queer people, people of colour, underrepresented people, that's been the cornerstone of like all of the programming decisions that we've made since I was in my position as associate director, and you know, setting up mentorship programs, etc. Like, you know, there's a lot that's happened, but I think it's also important in terms of this question around like linking it directly to translation. I'm interested in this question around underrepresented languages, and I think that actually that there's a lot of work to do on that across the board, everywhere in terms of theatres in the UK, and part of that is you know, broadening relationships, creating relationships in different countries, doing that sort of slow work that is feeling like it's getting somewhere. But and you know, through partnerships like Shabak Festival, which we've been working with as well. But I think that like it's important to recognise that on the question of like underrepresented languages, like that I don't think is where it needs to be anywhere in the UK, and like yeah, I think it's a good point to make.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Sorry, just briefly, you mentioned the Shabak Festival there. That's a festival of Arab literature and performance and arts. Is that right? Yeah. Thank you. Okay, what else have we got on my list of questions to finish us off? I've one question actually that came in, which again, it's sort of a similar question, was about the idea of programs to encourage existing theatre makers into translation. So I've lost the particular question. Oh yeah, so the ETPEP award exists to support non-playwright theatre makers who wish to move into playwriting. Could a similar award or program identify and encourage playwrights and other theatre makers with language skills to move into translation? Well, could it? I'm sure it could, but I guess there's a question there about how, I guess, and where would it belong? I guess maybe, Sam, that feeds into a question broadly about funding. Ultimately, isn't it? We have great ideas across the whole industry about things that we'd like to do, but there's a question of how we do it. Yeah,
I think it's a little bit about funding, but I would also say that there is I think a challenge about connectedness that a lot of this goes, or some of these things go back to, in terms of engaging a wider range of artists from different professional and individual backgrounds in translation. And I would say that to me, translation is an area where perhaps more so than other disciplines, your access to the material is really key. That if you have had the good fortune to be able to travel to international theatre festivals or to make connections with artists internationally, or you have relationships that allow you to access different work that might not be publicly available, those are big advantages, I think, in terms of a step into the world of translation in theatre. And it's probably the case that it's definitely the case that I think institutions could do a lot more to support that kind of access, and also maybe there is a thing about the way in which the theatres, festivals and companies who make international work in the UK, or who make work that's written by artists who aren't based in the UK, could work in a much more collaborative way to share and pool resources and knowledge about different translators, because I think that would help more work be produced potentially, and help pathways for individual translators whose work institutions in an isolated way might not be aware of.
Thank you very much, Sam. And I'm afraid it is 3:30, and I'm going to resist my temptation to just keep going like my workshop colleagues have been finding. But I think that's a really important note to end on, which is the idea that we've been fortunate this week to have space to discuss amongst different colleagues working in different places this phenomenon of international theatre and translated theatre, and the collaboration between institutions, between literary translation world, between the theatre world, between many other worlds across the world, and how it sounds to me that we're all agreed that if we can find more opportunities to continue having these conversations and to find ways to create those collaborative spaces for exploration, then it seems we all stand to benefit. And I feel I've benefited hugely from being allowed to spend 90 recorded minutes and 30 live minutes with Sam Pritchard, Anthony Simpson-Pike and Trine Garrett. Thank you very much for your generosity of your time and of your thoughts, and it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, and I hope we can do it again sometime.